"Did you just insult my mum?" She didn't scream it. She didn't stomp her feet. She asked it with the bone-chilling calmness of a judge delivering a final sentence. Her name was Zara Okoye, and at 6 years old, she stood in that dusty market in a bright orange dress, her braided hair clicking with colorful beads as she tilted her head. To Zara, the world wasn't divided into powerful and weak. It was divided into people with manners and people who needed to be taught some. Adrian Volkov looked down at her, his cold, intense eyes narrowing. This was the man whose name made the city's elite tremble, a man with a sharp jawline and a dark neck tattoo that whispered of a very violent past. He looked less like a human and more like a predator in a tailored black suit. "Go back to your mother, little girl," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "I will," Zara replied, adjusted her round glasses, and didn't move an inch. "Right after you apologize." Behind Adrian, Viktor Sokolov, his broad-shouldered enforcer, actually blinked in disbelief. Dmitri and Leon, two muscular bodyguards who usually looked like stone statues, suddenly found the cracks in the pavement very interesting. Nobody looked at the boss. Nobody breathed. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Adrian asked, his voice dropping an octave. Zara looked him up and down, the way a person looks at a piece of fruit that's clearly gone rotten. "No," she said. "But I know what your man said to my mom, and I know it was mean. So it doesn't really matter who you are, does it?" "Okay, hold on, besties. Stop the tape. Have you ever seen a child walk straight into the lion's den and start lecturing the lion on his table manners? Because that is exactly what we are witnessing. We have Zara, a tiny queen in an orange dress, standing off against Adrian Volkov, a man who literally owns the city's shadows, in the middle of a crowded market. If you love stories where the smallest person has the biggest heart and the sharpest tongue, you need to hit subscribe and turn on those notifications. Because the way Adrian reacts to this braid-shaking defiance, absolutely nobody, not even his own men, was ready for it. The silence in the market was heavy. Mrs. Lin Wei, the vendor at the next stall, dropped a crate of oranges and didn't even try to catch them. Even Daniel Reyes, watching from the shadows with his undercover eyes, stopped taking notes. His hand was literally frozen over his notepad. Adrian studied Zara the way you study a puzzle piece that doesn't belong to the box you're holding. He noticed the way her beads caught the light and the defiant stance she took, despite being barely taller than his waist. "You're very brave for someone so small," Adrian remarked, a hint of something that wasn't quite amusement, but wasn't quite anger crossing his face. Zara nodded, her expression dead serious. "My mom says bravery doesn't have a height requirement. She says if you're right, you stand tall even if you have to look up." Adrian's gaze flickered. "She sounds like a woman who knows her mind." "She is," Zara said. "She's the strongest person in the world. She braids my hair and runs this stall and makes sure I have my books for school. So when your man walks by and says she's slow and useless just because he's in a hurry, that's not okay, Mr. Suit. That's not okay at all." From behind the stall, Amara had been paralyzed. Her heart was a drum in her chest, fear for her daughter warring with a sudden, strange jolt of recognition. She looked at the man in the suit, at the sharp jaw and the specific curve of that neck tattoo, and the world seemed to tilt. She stepped out, her voice trembling but clear. "Zara, baby, come here now." Zara didn't budge. "Almost done, Mom. Just waiting for the apology." Amara's eyes met Adrian's. For a split second, the market vanished. The noise, the heat, the bodyguards, all gone. Adrian held her gaze a second too long, his cold eyes searching hers for a ghost of a memory he couldn't quite place. Then he looked back down at the little girl in the orange dress. "And if I don't?" asked, almost conversationally. Zara considered this. She tapped her chin thoughtfully. "Well," she said, "I'll have to tell my Sunday school teacher, and shall tell the bishop, and hell put you on the prayer list for difficult people. And honestly, with that tattoo on your neck, you probably need all the help you can get." Victor made a sound that was definitely a muffled laugh. He immediately turned it into a cough, looking at the sky. Dmitri and Leon had completely turned their backs now, their shoulders shaking ever so slightly. Adrian Volkov, the man who feared nothing, looked at the 6-year-old girl and, for the first time in a decade, didn't know what to say. The silence in the market was no longer just a lack of noise. It was a physical weight, pressing down on the rows of hanging silks and the wooden crates of overripe mangoes. Viktor Sokolov, a man who had seen the inside of more interrogation rooms than he had seen his own mother, shifted his weight. His hand instinctively reached for the concealed holster under his jacket, but he stopped mid-motion. There was no enemy to shoot. There was only a child in a bright orange dress with beads that clicked every time she breathed. Adrian Volkov did not move. He was a man accustomed to the world bending to his will. When he walked, people parted like a dark tide. When he spoke, the air in the room usually chilled by 10 degrees. Yet here, under the afternoon sun, a 6-year-old girl with round glasses was looking at him as if he were a particularly disappointing student in a remedial class. A prayer list, Adrian finally spoke, his voice low and gravelly, cutting through the stagnant air. "You think I belong on a list for difficult people?" Zara didn't flinch. She crossed her small arms over her chest, the orange fabric of her dress wrinkling. "Well, you're not on the good morning list, are you? My mom says a gentleman always leads with kindness, especially when he's in a hurry." Your man, she pointed a tiny, accusing finger at Victor, who looked as though he wanted to melt into the cobblestones, wasn't being a gentleman. He was being a cloud. A cloud, Adrian repeated, tilting his head. "Dark, loud, and ruining everyone's sunny day," Zara explained with a sigh of exaggerated patience. "And since you're the boss, that means you let him do it, which makes you a bigger cloud." Behind Adrian, Dimitri and Leon shared a glance that was thick with terror. They had seen Adrian break a man's hand for simply interrupting him mid-sentence. They waited for the explosion, for the cold command to clear the stall, for the violence that usually followed any sign of disrespect. But the explosion didn't come. Instead, Adrian took a step forward, closing the gap until the toe of his expensive Italian leather shoe was inches from Zara's scuffed sandals. He sank down, one knee hitting the dirt of the market floor. The sight was surreal. A man who sat on a throne of shadow was kneeling in the dust to be at eye level with a child who smelled like laundry soap and cinnamon. "Zara," he said, the name sounding strange and heavy on his tongue. "If I apologize, does the cloud go away?" "The cloud goes away," Zara nodded, her beads clicking. "And then we can talk about your neck." Adrian's hand instinctively went to the dark ink on his skin, the jagged, intricate tattoo that marked him as the head of the Volkov syndicate. "What about my neck? It looks like it hurt," she said softly, her defiance momentarily replaced by a flash of genuine, childish empathy. "My mom says scars are just stories we haven't told yet. You must have a lot of stories." In that moment, Amara finally found her legs. She moved toward them, her hands reaching out to pull Zara back, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew that tattoo. She knew the way his eyes caught the light, shifting from slate gray to something warmer when he was curious. Memories she had buried under years of hard work and early mornings were screaming to the surface. "Zara, please," Amara whispered, her voice catching. She reached her daughter and placed her hands on the girl's shoulders, feeling the small, sturdy frame. She didn't look at Adrian directly. She couldn't. The power he radiated was too much, a reminder of a life she had escaped and a night she could never quite forget. "We have customers, baby. Let the gentleman go." Adrian stood up slowly, the height difference returning in an instant. He brushed a speck of market dust from his knee, his movements deliberate and calm. He looked at Amara then, not the way a boss looks at a vendor, but the way a man looks at a mystery he has just started to solve. He saw the way her fingers trembled on Zara's shoulders. He saw the strength in her jaw. "Your daughter has a very specific set of requirements for my presence in this market." "Amara," he said. The sound of her name coming from him made the air leave her lungs. It had been years. And yet the weight of his voice felt like a hand on her heart. "She's just a child," Amara said, her voice regaining some of its steel. "She doesn't know who she's talking to, on the contrary," Adrian said, turning his gaze back to Zara. "I think she's the only one in the city who knows exactly who I am, or at least, who I'm supposed to be." He looked back at his men. Victor was still standing there, looking caught between a heart attack and a stroke. The rest of the market had gone back to a hushed, fake busyness, but every ear was tuned to the stall. "Victor," Adrian commanded. The right-hand man stepped forward, bowing his head slightly. "Yes, boss," apologized to the lady. Properly, Victor's eyes widened, but he knew better than to hesitate. He turned to Amara, his face flushing a deep, embarrassed red. I was out of line. Please accept my apologies for my rudeness earlier. It won't happen again." Zara watched the exchange with the critical eye of a supervisor. When Victor finished, she looked up at Adrian and gave a single, firm nod. "Better. Much better, see. That didn't even hurt, did it?" Adrian didn't smile. He wasn't a man who smiled, but the corners of his eyes crinkled in a way that terrified Victor even more than a beating would have. "No, Zara, it didn't hurt at all." He turned to leave, his men falling into formation behind him like a well-oiled machine. They marched out of the market, their footsteps rhythmic and heavy, the black suits cutting a path through the colorful stalls. But as they reached the edge of the market, Adrian stopped. He didn't turn around, but he stood still for a heartbeat longer than necessary, his silhouette framed by the late afternoon sun. Back at the stall, Amara held Zara tightly, her eyes fixed on the retreating back of the man she had hoped never to see again. Zara, blissfully unaware of the tectonic plates that had just shifted beneath their feet, reached up and adjusted her glasses. "He's not so scary," Mom, Zara whispered, picking up a fallen bead from the counter. "He just needs someone to tell him the rules." "I think he'll come back." Amara felt a cold chill despite the heat. "I know he will, Zara," she whispered into her daughter's hair. "I know he will." As the Volkov motorcade pulled away, the market slowly returned to its chaotic life. But the atmosphere had changed. Mrs. Lin Wei was already whispering to a neighbor. Daniel Reyes was tucked in a corner, his phone to his ear, his voice low and urgent. The boss of the city had been brought to his knee by a girl in an orange dress, and in the world of Adrian Volkov, that was a story that would travel faster than a bullet. Adrian sat in the back of his darkened car, his eyes fixed on the window. He touched the tattoo on his neck, his mind racing through fragments of a past he had thought was dead. He thought of the girl's glasses, the way they sat on her nose, and the way she had looked at him without an ounce of the fear he spent his life cultivating. "Victor," Adrian said into the silence of the car. "Yes, boss, clear my schedule for tomorrow afternoon. I am going back to the market." Victor didn't ask why. He didn't mention the 3 meetings with the shipping magnates or the sit-down with the rival families. He simply nodded and reached for his phone. The march of the Volkov Empire had been stopped by a 6-year-old's lecture on manners, and for the first time in his life, Adrian Volkov was looking forward to the next lesson. The sun had barely begun its descent over the marketplace the following afternoon when a familiar, heavy silence started to ripple through the crowd. It wasn't the usual noise of haggling or the clatter of carts. It was the sound of people holding their breath. At the edge of the market, 3 black SUVs pulled to a smooth stop, their engines humming like idling predators. Zara Okoye felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up before she even saw him. She was busy rearranging a stack of yams, her hands moving with a practiced rhythm that belied the absolute chaos in her chest. She had spent the previous night staring at the ceiling, wondering if she should pack their bags and disappear before dawn. But looking at Zara, who was happily polishing her round glasses with the hem of her orange dress, Amara had decided to stay. Running only confirmed you were a victim. Staying meant you were a mother. When the shadow fell across her stall, it was long and sharp. Adrian Volkov stood there, looking just as imposing as he had the day before, though he had traded his black tie for an open-collar shirt that made him look slightly less like a corporate executioner and slightly more like a man on a mission. Behind him, Victor and the 2 bodyguards, Dimitri and Leon, stood like a wall of dark fabric and stern expressions. "The tea," Adrian said. His voice was a calm, steady vibration that seemed to settle deep in the ground. Amara looked up, her fingers tightening around a tuber. "I am sorry." "My man mentioned the tea here was restorative," Adrian said, his eyes flicking momentarily to Victor, who looked as though he had never tasted tea in his entire life. "I find myself in need of something restorative today." It was a blatant lie, and everyone in a 10-foot radius knew it. Mrs. Lin Wei, 3 stalls down, stopped pretending to weigh bok choy and leaned in so far she nearly tipped over her scale. "We sell hibiscus tea and ginger brew," Amara said, her voice careful and neutral. "It's $5 a cup, no discounts for gentlemen in suits." A faint, almost imperceptible twitch appeared at the corner of Adrian's mouth. $5 seems fair for a miracle cure." Before Amara could reach for a cup, a small head popped up from behind a crate of peppers. Zara stood there, her braids bouncing, her eyes magnified behind her lenses as she studied the man before her. She didn't look at his expensive watch or his intimidating height. She looked straight at his shoes. "You cleaned them," Zara noted, pointing a finger at his polished Oxfords. "The market dirt is gone." Adrian looked down at his feet and then back at the little girl. "I was told first impressions are important, but second impressions are where the real work begins." "That's a good rule," Zara said approvingly. She climbed out from behind the stall and walked around to the front, standing right next to the mob boss. To any observer, the sight was terrifying. A man who could erase a person with a phone call standing next to a child whose biggest weapon was a blunt observation. "Do you want the ginger one? It's spicy. It makes your nose tingle." "I think I can handle a tingling nose, Zara," Adrian replied. Amara poured the tea into a paper cup, her movements stiff. As she handed it to him, their fingers brushed. It was a brief, accidental contact, but the heat of it sent a jolt through her. She saw his eyes darken, a flash of something ancient and recognition-heavy passing through his gaze. He didn't look away, and for a heartbeat the market noise faded into a dull hum. "Back because of the tea?" Amara asked, her voice lower now, meant only for him. "I'm back because I dislike unfinished business," Adrian said, his voice equally quiet. He took a sip of the tea, the steam rising against his sharp jawline. "And because your daughter is the only person in this city who doesn't lie to me." He stepped back and leaned against one of the sturdy wooden pillars of the stall. He didn't leave. He didn't demand a seat. He simply stood there, sipping his $5 ginger tea, watching. He watched Zara as she helped a grandmother pick out the best tomatoes. He watched the way she chatted incessantly, explaining to a confused tourist why the orange dress was her power color. He watched how she hummed to herself when she thought no one was looking, her beads clicking a soft rhythm against her neck. To the rest of the market, it was a daily inspection. Rumor was already spreading. Volkov was taxing the stall, or Volkov was looking to buy the block. But to the men standing behind Adrian, the reality was much stranger. They watched their boss, a man who usually counted seconds like they were gold, waste an entire hour standing in the heat just to watch a little girl play. Victor cleared his throat softly. "Sir, the meeting with the Greeks is in 20 minutes. Adrian didn't even look at his watch. "The Greeks can wait. They thrive on patience." "Sir?" "Victor," Adrian said, his tone shifting just enough to make the enforcer go silent. "The tea is excellent. Be quiet and enjoy the atmosphere." Zara, sensing the tension, walked over to Victor and squinted at him. "You look like you have a tummy ache, Mr. Grumpy. Do you want some ginger too? It helps with the bubbles." Leon and Dmitri turned their heads away simultaneously, their shoulders shaking with suppressed laughter. Victor looked at his boss, pleading for help, but Adrian only raised his cup in a silent, mocking toast. "I think he's okay, Zara," Adrian said, finally stepping away from the pillar. He finished the tea and set the empty cup on the counter. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a $100 bill, sliding it across the wood toward Amara. "It's $5, Amara said, not touching the money. "Rest is for the education," Adrian said. He looked at Zara. "What's the lesson for today, teacher?" Zara tapped her chin, her expression grave. "Don't let your friends be clouds, and always say thank you when the tea is good." Adrian looked at Amara, a long, searching look that felt like a question he wasn't yet ready to ask out loud. Then he turned back to the child. "Thank you, Zara. The tea was very good." He turned on his heel, his coat flaring behind him as he signaled to his men. As the black SUVs roared back to life and pulled away, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake, the market finally began to breathe again. Mrs. Lin Wei scurried over immediately. "Amara, what did he say? Is he coming back?" "Is he going to hurt us?" Amara didn't answer. She was looking at the $100 bill on the counter, then at Zara, who was already back to arranging the peppers by size. "Mom," Zara asked, looking up, "why does Mr. Suit have so many secrets in his eyes?" Amara felt a lump in her throat she couldn't swallow. She pulled Zara into a hug, burying her face in the scent of laundry soap and the market spices. "Everyone has secrets, Zara. Some people just have more room to hide them than others." High above them, tucked into the second-story window of a neighboring building, Daniel Reyes lowered his binoculars. He adjusted his earpiece, his face grim. "He was there for 62 minutes, Daniel whispered into his mic. "He didn't take a bribe, he didn't threaten her. He just watched the kid. Copy that. Something is happening here that isn't on the books. I am staying on them." As the sun dipped lower, casting long, orange shadows over the stall, the $100 sat on the counter like a promise or a threat. Amara wasn't sure which. All she knew was that Adrian Volkov hadn't come for the tea. He had come for the mirror Zara held up to him. And she knew, with a certainty that terrified her, that he wouldn't be able to stay away for long. Daniel Reyes sat in the cramped, sweltering second-story room above the tailor's shop, his eyes pressed against the rubber seals of his binoculars. The market below was a kaleidoscope of movement, but his focus remained fixed on the small fruit stall at the corner. He had been tracking Adrian Volkov for 18 months, following a trail of cold blood and colder money, but the last 48 hours had made his entire career feel like a lie. He adjusted the focus dial, bringing Adrian's face into sharp relief. The most dangerous man in the city was standing under a sun-faded canopy, holding a paper cup of tea as if it were a rare vintage. Daniel's thumb hovered over the shutter button of his camera. He had thousands of photos of Adrian at high-stakes poker games, Adrian leaving the scenes of fires, Adrian shaking hands with corrupt officials. But he didn't have any of Adrian watching a child play with a pile of yams. "Talk to me, Rays," a voice crackled in his earpiece. It was his supervisor, Miller, back at the precinct. "What's the play? Is he leaning on the vendor? We've got a tactical team 2 blocks out if he starts breaking bones." Daniel didn't answer immediately. He watched as Zara, the girl in the orange dress, reached up and adjusted the collar of Adrian's shirt. Any other man in the world would have been missing a hand for touching the Volkov boss like that. Instead, Adrian stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the girl with an intensity that looked less like a threat and more like a man trying to remember a dream. Negative on the tactical, Daniel finally whispered, his voice low and raspy. "There's no aggression. No money changing hands except for a cup of tea. It's something else. What else could it be? He's Volkov. He doesn't go to the market for the fresh produce." Daniel zoomed in further. He watched Amara, the mother. She was moving around the stall, her body language stiff and defensive, but her eyes kept drifting back to Adrian's neck. She looked like someone watching a ghost. And then there was Adrian. For a man who lived his life looking over his shoulder for assassins, he seemed remarkably unguarded. He wasn't scanning the crowd. He wasn't looking for exits. He was just there. "He's been there for an hour," Daniel said, his brow furrowing. "He's missed 3 high-level meetings." Victor looks like he's having a nervous breakdown, but Volkov hasn't moved. He's watching the girl. And the way she looks at him, she's not afraid. It's not the frozen with terror kind of quiet. She's lecturing him. She's bossing him around. Maybe she's a hostage, Miller suggested. No, Daniel countered, his instincts screaming. He's the one who looks trapped by something he's seeing in her. "Look, I am looking at the mother's face now. She isn't just scared of a mobster. She's terrified of the man." "There's a history there, Miller. I can feel it through the glass." Daniel lowered the binoculars and leaned back against the peeling wallpaper of the room. He wiped sweat from his forehead. His job was to build a RICO case, to find the cracks in the Volkov empire and drive a wedge through them. But what he was seeing wasn't a crack in the business. It was a crack in the man. He pulled up a digital file on his tablet, the few redacted pages they had on Adrian's early life. It was a blank slate. Volkov had appeared out of nowhere 6 or 7 years ago, rising through the ranks with a clinical, detached violence that had cleared the board of all his rivals. Before that, nothing. Just rumors of a young man working the docks, a ghost with no family and no ties. Daniel looked back down at the market. He saw Amara hand Adrian a bag of oranges. Their eyes met for a heartbeat, and the tension was so thick Daniel could almost taste it. It wasn't the tension of a victim and a predator. It was the electricity of 2 people who had shared a life-altering moment and were now standing on opposite sides of a canyon, wondering if they could still hear each other's voices. "It's not a shakedown," Daniel whispered into his mic, more to himself than to Miller. "Say again, it's not a shakedown. He's not here for the stall. He's not here for the territory." Daniel picked up the camera and snapped a series of photos of the 3 of them, Adrian, Amara, and Zara, framed together by the morning sun. It looked like a family portrait, if you could ignore the 3 men in suits standing guard with their hands over their belts. Then why is he there, Rays? "Give me something I can put in a report. It's a reunion," Daniel said, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. He's looking for something he lost, or maybe something he didn't even know he had. "You're sounding like a novelist, not a cop. Stick to the facts." "The fact is," Daniel said, his eyes narrowing as he watched Adrian ruffle Zara's hair before turning to leave, that Adrian Volkov just spent $100 on $5 worth of tea and didn't ask for change. "The fact is, he's coming back tomorrow. And the fact is, if the other families find out that the most feared man in the city has a soft spot in an orange dress, this market is going to become a war zone." Daniel watched as the SUVs pulled away. He stayed in the room long after the dust had settled and the crowd had returned to its normal, frantic pace. He watched Amara sink onto a crate, her head in her hands, while Zara played with the colorful beads in her hair. He knew what his orders were. He was supposed to report any vulnerability, any leverage they could use to flip Volkov or take him down. But as he looked at the photo on his camera screen, the way Adrian's cold eyes seemed to soften just a fraction when Zara laughed, Daniel felt a strange, unwelcome tug of hesitation. He reached out and turned off the monitor. "He's not just a boss anymore," Daniel muttered, staring at the empty street. "He's a father." He knew that if he was right, the story he was documenting wasn't just about the fall of a criminal empire. It was about the impossible survival of a heart. And as an undercover observer, he was no longer just watching a target. He was watching a fuse burn toward a very large, very dangerous hidden truth. Staying on them, Miller," he said, his voice firming up. "But keep the tactical teams away. This isn't a bust. Not yet. We need to see how far this goes before we break it." He sat back in the shadows, his own eye fixed on the empty space where the little girl had been standing, knowing that the next time the black cars arrived, the stakes wouldn't just be about the law. They would be about blood. The following afternoon, the ritual of the black SUVs had become almost predictable. The market vendors no longer scurried away in terror. Instead, they lingered nearby, pretending to organize their displays while keeping their eyes glued to the Okoye stall. Adrian Volkov was already there, leaning against his usual wooden pillar with a fresh cup of ginger tea in his hand. He looked less like a threat and more like a permanent fixture of the architecture. However, the focus of the afternoon had shifted away from the boss. Zara stood in the middle of the narrow walkway, her hands firmly on her hips and her bright orange dress catching the sunlight. She was currently standing directly in front of Dimitri and Leon, who were positioned like two granite boulders on either side of the stall. Their hands were crossed at their waists, their earpieces were snug, and their expressions were as cold and lifeless as a winter morning in Siberia. Zara looked at Dimitri, then leaned to the left to peer at Leon. She let out a heavy, dramatic sigh that seemed much too large for her small frame. "You too," she said, shaking her head so hard her colorful beads rattled like a warning. "You look like you just ate lemons. Very sour ones." Dimitri didn't blink. Leon's gaze remained fixed on a point somewhere above a fruit crate across the street. They had been trained to ignore distractions, to be invisible walls of meat and muscle. They had survived gunfights and high-speed chases, but they hadn't been trained for a 6-year-old girl with round glasses and a mission. "Mr. Boss," Zara called out, looking over her shoulder at Adrian. "Your helpers are broken. They don't have any happy on their faces." Adrian took a slow sip of his tea, his eyes glinting with a rare, hidden amusement. "They aren't paid to be happy, Zara. They are paid to be observant." "Well, observing looks very grumpy," Zara countered. She turned back to the two giants. "Today we are having a class, an etiquette class. Because if you're going to stand at my mom's stall, you have to look like you're enjoying the tea, not like you're waiting for a tooth pulled." Victor, standing a few feet back, tried to suppress a smirk, but a sharp look from Adrian silenced him. The boss waved a hand dismissively toward his men. "Proceed, Zara." They could use the improvement. Zara marched up to Dimitri, the more muscular of the two. She reached up as high as she could, which only brought her fingertips to the middle of his chest. "Lower, please." "I can't fix your face if I'm down here." Dimitri looked at Adrian, his eyes pleading for a way out. Adrian just leaned back further against the pillar, his expression saying "do as she says." With a visible swallow, the massive bodyguard bent at the waist, lowering his face until he was eye level with the child. "Okay," Zara said, inspecting his features. "Your mouth is a flat line. It needs to go up at the ends, like a little boat." She used her tiny index fingers to push at the corners of Dimitri's mouth. Dimitri's face twisted into a grimace that looked more like a snarl than a smile. It was terrifying in its own way. "No, no," Zara said, dropping her hands in frustration. "That's a scary smile. That's the smile a crocodile gives a fish. Think about something nice. Do you like puppies or ice cream?" "I like motorcycles," Dimitri rumbled, his voice like gravel grinding together. "Fine. Think about a fast motorcycle," Zara commanded. "Now lift the corners." Softly, Dimitri tried again. This time his lips twitched upward just a fraction. It wasn't a full smile, but the murderous edge had softened. Zara clapped her hands. "Better. Now, Leon, your turn." Leon didn't wait to be told. He knelt down on one knee, his suit trousers stretching tight over his frame. He had a subtle scar near his eye that Zara touched gently with a curious finger. He flinched slightly but didn't pull away. "This is a brave mark," she whispered. "But it doesn't mean you have to be sad. A smile is just manners for your face. For the next 20 minutes, the market watched the most absurd sight in its long history. A small girl in an orange dress walked between two of the city's most dangerous enforcers, correcting their posture and demanding they practice their crinkly eyes. She taught them that a smile shouldn't involve showing all their teeth at once, and that they should try to look at the people passing by as friends, not targets. Amara watched from behind the counter, her hands busy with a bag of dried hibiscus, but her mind was elsewhere. She watched Adrian watching Zara. He wasn't looking at the bodyguards. He was looking at the way Zara moved, the effortless confidence, the way she took up space without an ounce of doubt. "She has your spirit," Adrian said suddenly, his voice low enough that only Amara could hear. Amara didn't look up. "She has her own spirit. I just try to keep out of its way." "She isn't afraid of the dark," Adrian noted, gesturing toward his men. "Most people see them and see death. She sees someone who needs a lesson in kindness." "Where does a child learn that, Amara?" "She learns it by seeing me survive every day without a suit or a gun," Amara said, finally meeting his eyes. The defiance was still there, but it was tempered by a deep, weary sadness. "She thinks the world is a good place because I work very hard to make sure she doesn't see the parts that aren't." Adrian looked down at his tea. "The parts that aren't good, they have a way of finding people, even if they're hiding. Is that why you're here, Adrian? To bring the dark part to her, here," he said, his voice turning cold and heavy, "because for the first time in 6 years I can breathe without feeling like I am choking. This market, this stall, it's the only place where the air is clear." He stood up straight, his presence immediately shifting the energy of the area. He looked at his men. Dimitri and Leon were still standing there, their expressions remarkably less grumpy. They looked human, uncomfortable, but human. "Class is over for today," Zara announced, wiping her hands on her dress. "You guys are still C- students, but you're getting better." Adrian reached out and gently tapped the top of Zara's head. It was a gesture so fatherly, so domestic, that Amara felt a physical ache in her chest. "We have to go, Zara," Adrian said. "There are people waiting to be difficult." "Don't be a cloud today," Zara reminded him. "I'll try," he replied. As they walked away, Adrian noticed a man standing near a vegetable cart, a man who looked a bit too focused on his phone. Daniel Reyes quickly looked away, but Adrian's instincts were already humming. He didn't say anything to his men. He didn't call for an investigation. He simply got into the back of his car and sat in the darkness. "Sir," Victor said from the front seat. "The bodyguards, they seem a bit distracted." "Let them be," Adrian said, looking out at the stall as it grew smaller in the distance. "A little humanity won't kill them. It might actually make them harder to hit." He leaned his head back and closed his eyes. He could still feel the phantom sensation of Zara's tiny hand on his head, and for the first time in his life, the most feared man in the city felt a strange, terrifying sensation. He felt like he wanted to be the man she thought he was, and that, he knew, was the most dangerous thing of all. The rain had started as a fine mist, turning the market's red dirt paths into a slick, dark clay. Most of the vendors had pulled their plastic tarps low, but Amara remained at her post, her hands moving mechanically as she wiped down the wooden edges of the stall. Zara was safely tucked under the counter, humming a song about a brave butterfly, her colorful beads clicking softly against the floorboards. When the black SUV pulled up today, there was no tea waiting. The humidity made everything heavy, including the silence that followed Adrian Volkov as he stepped out of the vehicle. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket today. He had rolled his sleeves up to his elbows, revealing forearms that were corded with muscle and etched with several smaller, faded scars. "It's a bad day for a walk, Mr. Suit," Zara called out from her hiding spot, her head popping out from under the counter like a curious bird. "I've walked through worse," Adrian replied, stopping at the edge of the stall. He looked tired. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there the day before, a sign that the difficult people he dealt with were starting to demand more of his time. Amara reached for a bundle of dried herbs, her movements stiff. "The ginger tea is finished. The rain kept the fire from catching this morning. I didn't come for the tea, Amara," Adrian said. He reached out to steady a hanging scale that was swinging wildly in the wind. As he raised his arm, the light from the gray sky caught the underside of his right wrist. Amara's breath hitched in her throat. She froze, her fingers clutching the herbs so tightly the dry leaves crinkled into dust. There, just below the thumb, was a faint, jagged mark, not a tattoo, but a scar. It was shaped like a broken crescent moon, perfectly mirrored by a small, white line that ran through his pulse point. The world around her seemed to lose its sound. The shouting of the fishmongers and the rhythmic patter of the rain faded into a dull roar in her ears. 6 years. 6 years she had spent convincing herself that the man from that night, the man who had stumbled into the back alley of the clinic where she worked, bleeding and breathless, was a ghost. She remembered the way his hands had trembled as she stitched that very wound. She remembered how he had looked at her with those same slate-gray eyes, stripped of his armor, telling her his name wasn't Adrian, but simply a boy trying to survive the night. He had been a shadow then, a man fleeing a life he wasn't sure he wanted. They had spent only a few hours together in the quiet, dim light of the back room, tucked away from the rain much like this, sharing a loaf of bread and a terrifying, desperate kind of honesty. And then he was gone. And then Zara had arrived. Amara Adrian's voice broke through her trance. He had noticed her starring. He slowly lowered his arm, but he didn't pull the sleeve down. He watched her face, his expression unreadable, though his jaw was set tight. Amara looked up at him, her eyes wide and searching. She wasn't seeing the mafia boss now. She was seeing the boy on the steps. She was seeing the father of the child currently playing at her feet. That mark, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. I thought I'd imagined it. For years, I told myself the memory was just a trick of the light. Adrian didn't look away. The air between them hummed with the weight of the unspoken. Some things don't disappear just because you stop looking at them, Amara. I spent a long time trying to find that clinic again. But the city changes. People move. Shadows get longer. You didn't look hard enough, she said, a flash of old anger sparking in her eyes. Or maybe you were looking for the wrong thing. Zara, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere, stood up and walked between them. She looked at her mother's pale face, then up at Adrian's intense gaze. She reached out and touched the scar on Adrian's wrist with a gentle, inquisitive finger. This one looks like a moon, Zara said softly. Did it hurt when you got it? Adrian knelt down, oblivious to the mud soaking into his expensive trousers. He looked at Zara, really looked at her, and Amara saw the exact moment the realization hit him. He saw the curve of her nose, the way her eyes crinkled in the corners just like his did when he was thinking. He saw the daughter he had never known he was searching for. It hurt for a long time, Adrian said to Zara, his voice thick with a sudden, raw emotion. But I think it's finally starting to heal. He looked back up at Amara. The power dynamic had completely flipped. He wasn't the kingpin anymore, and she wasn't the humble vendor. They were just two people standing in the rain, caught in the gravity of a truth that was too big for the small stall to hold. Why didn't you find me? He asked, his voice a low, pained rumble. I didn't know who you were, Adrian. I knew a boy with a crescent scar who said he wanted to be a better man. The man I see on the news, the man who walks through this market with an army. That's not the man I remembered. Adrian flinched as if she had struck him. He stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. I became what I had to be to survive the people who gave me that scar. I thought I had left everything else behind. You left more than you knew, Amara said, her hand resting protectively on Zara's head. Victor stepped forward from the SUV, holding a large black umbrella, sensing the tension but not understanding its source. Sir, the weather is turning. We should move. Adrian ignored him. He reached out, his hand hovering near Amara's cheek for a second before he pulled it back, as if afraid he might break the fragile peace they had found. I'm not that boy anymore, Amara, he said quietly. But I am not just the man in the suit either. Not when I am here. Then who are you? She challenged. Adrian looked down at Zara, who was busy trying to catch raindrops in her hand. I am someone who is very late for an apology, he said, and someone who has a lot of time to make up for. He turned and walked back to the car without another word. The door closed with a heavy, final thud, and the motorcade moved off into the gray mist of the city. Amara stood there for a long time, the herbs forgotten on the counter. She felt a strange mix of terror and relief. The secret she had carried for 6 years was no longer hers alone. The lion knew he had a cub, and the cub had already started to tame him. Mom, Zara asked, tugging on her dress. Why are you crying? The rain is just water. Amara wiped her eyes and pulled Zara into a tight embrace. I'm not crying because of the rain, baby. I'm crying because the moon finally came out during the day. As the market lights began to flicker on, casting a warm glow over the wet pavement, Amara knew that their lives had changed forever. The recognition was complete. The past was no longer a ghost. It was a man in a black car, and he was coming back. Not for tea, and not for power, but for the family he had left in the shadows of a clinic alley 6 years ago. The following morning, The heat in the market was thick enough to taste, and a strange, electric stillness hummed through the air. Adrian Volkov was back at his usual post, though he wasn't leaning against the pillar today. He stood upright, his eyes constantly scanning the perimeter of the market. He had traded his tailored suit jacket for a simple black tactical shirt, and the crescent scar on his wrist was visible every time he reached for his cup of ginger tea. Amara was busy weighing bags of dried hibiscus, her hands moving with a frantic energy. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the boy from the clinic and the man from the motorcade merging into one terrifying, complicated reality. She kept Zara close, making the girl stay behind the counter to sort the colorful beads by shade rather than letting her wander the stalls. "You're looking at the shadows again, Mr. Suit," Zara said, peeking over the edge of the wood. "Are you looking for more grumpy students for my class?" Adrian looked down at her, and for a fleeting second, the coldness in his eyes thawed into something soft. "I'm just making sure the clouds stay away, Zara." But the clouds weren't made of rain today. At the far end of the market, a silver sedan with tinted windows screeched to a halt, followed immediately by two others. The sound of slamming doors echoed like gunshots. Men in gray jackets, not the black suits of the Volkov family, spilled out into the walkway. These weren't enforcers. They were street soldiers, younger and hungrier, looking to make a name for themselves by striking where the kingpin was most vulnerable. Victor Adrian's voice didn't rise, but it carried the sharp authority of a whip crack. Victor, Dmitri, and Leon were already moving, forming a tight semicircle in front of the stall. The market vendors began to scramble, pulling their shutters down and ducking behind crates. Mrs. Linway ducked under her table, her eyes wide with terror. Volkov, a man in a gray jacket, shouted, his hand hidden inside his waistband. "You've gotten soft, spending your afternoons in the dirt with the peasants? The families think you've forgotten who owns these streets." Adrian didn't answer. He didn't even look at the man. His entire focus was on the small girl who was now standing on her tiptoes, trying to see what the commotion was about. "Zara, get down," Amara hissed, reaching for her daughter's arm. But it was too late. One of the rival soldiers, sensing an opportunity to cause chaos, kicked over a crate of yams and pulled a handgun. The crowd erupted into a panicked scream, people trampling over each other to reach the exits. In the confusion, a heavy wooden display from the neighboring stall was knocked loose, tilting precariously toward Zara. Before the wood could fall, and before a single shot was fired, Adrian moved. He didn't call for his guards. He didn't reach for a weapon. He lunged across the counter, his large frame shielding Zara entirely. He scooped her up in one arm and pulled her into the hollow of his chest, using his own back as a shield against the falling display and the potential crossfire. The wooden display crashed against Adrian's shoulder, splintering loudly, but he didn't even flinch. He remained hunched over her, his hand cupping the back of her head, pressing her face into his shirt so she wouldn't see the violence about to unfold. "Stay down," Adrian roared at Amara, grabbing her wrist and pulling her into the narrow, protected space behind the heavy stone base of the stall. The air was suddenly filled with the deafening rhythm of gunfire. Victor and the others returned fire with surgical precision, their training taking over. The men in gray jackets hadn't expected the Volkov guards to be so fiercely protective of a simple fruit stall. They had expected a hit and run, but they had walked into a fortress. Zara was shivering against Adrian's chest, her small hands clutching the fabric of his shirt. He could feel her heart racing like a trapped bird. He tightened his grip, his chin resting on top of her braided hair. He smelled the cinnamon and soap on her, a scent that felt impossibly pure in the middle of the gunpowder smoke. "Close your eyes, Zara," Adrian whispered, his voice steady and calm amidst the chaos. "Just listen to my heart. Don't look at the clouds." Amara was huddled beside them, her eyes fixed on Adrian. She saw the blood trickling down his arm where the splintered wood had sliced through his shirt. She saw the way he didn't even care about his own wound, his only concern being the tiny girl in his arms. In that moment of absolute terror, the last of her doubts vanished. A man didn't protect a child like that for leverage. He did it because he was protecting his soul. The skirmish was over as quickly as it had begun. The rival gang, realizing they were outmatched and outpositioned, scrambled back to their cars and sped away, leaving the market in a state of shattered silence. Victor stepped over a fallen crate, his weapon still raised. Clear Adrian didn't move immediately. He waited until the sound of the retreating engines faded completely. He slowly exhaled, his muscles uncoiling like a released spring. He pulled back slightly, looking down at Zara. Her round glasses were crooked on her face, and a few of her colorful beads had been knocked loose, but she was unharmed. "Are you?" asked, his voice raspier than usual. Zara looked up at him, her eyes wide. She reached up and touched the blood on his arm. "You're leaking, Mr. Suit." "It's nothing," Adrian said, finally letting out a breath. Amara lunged forward, snatching Zara from his arms and clutching her so tightly the girl let out a small squeak. Amara's eyes were frantic, checking Zara for any scratches before finally turning her gaze to Adrian. "You're hurt," Amara said, her voice trembling. "I've had worse," Adrian replied, standing up and brushing the dust from his trousers. He looked at Victor, his expression turning into something cold and terrifying. "Find out who sent them. I want their names by sunset. And tell the families that if they ever bring their noise to this market again, I will burn their houses to the ground with them inside." Victor nodded, his face grim. "Yes, boss." Adrian turned back to the stall. He looked at the shattered wood and the ruined fruit scattered across the ground. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a roll of bills, tossing it onto the counter without looking. "Get a new stall," he told Amara. "A stronger one." "Adrian, wait," Amara called out as he began to walk away. He stopped but didn't turn around. "Thank you," she whispered. For her, Adrian's shoulders tensed. He looked at his hand, the one that had been holding Zara, and saw that it was shaking. He made a fist, hiding the tremor. "She told me bravery doesn't have a height requirement," he said quietly. "I'm just trying to keep up." He climbed into the SUV, and the door closed with a final, heavy thud. As the motorcade pulled away, the market began to stir again, people emerging from their hiding spots to survey the damage. Zara stood by her mother's side, looking at the spot where the black car had been. She reached down and picked up one of her fallen beads, a bright orange one. "Mom," she asked softly. "Yes, baby, mister." Suit's heart was beating really fast. Like a drum, Amara knelt down and tucked a stray braid behind Zara's ear. "That's because he was scared, Zara, scared of the men with the loud noises." "No," Amara said, looking toward the end of the street where the black SUVs had vanished. "He was scared of losing you." As the sun beat down on the ruined yams and the spent shell casings, Amara knew the world had changed. The secret was no longer just a memory, it was a war. And for the first time in 6 years, she knew that they weren't fighting it alone. The lion had shown his teeth, and he had shown them for his cub. The evening air was cooler after the rain, carrying the scent of damp earth and charcoal from distant cooking fires. The market was emptying, the usual bustle replaced by the rhythmic sound of sweeping brooms and the distant clatter of closing shutters. Amara sat on a small stool behind her ruined counter, her hands steady as she threaded a new set of bright orange beads onto a string. Zara was asleep inside the small back room of the stall, her chest rising and falling in the deep, peaceful rhythm of a child who believed the world had been saved. When the black sedan pulled up, it didn't stop at the edge of the market. It crawled forward, stopping only a few feet from the stall. Adrian Volkov stepped out alone. He had sent Victor and the others to wait by the main gate, a rare gesture of vulnerability that didn't go unnoticed by Amara. His arm was bandaged over his shirt, a white patch against the black fabric, marking the spot where he had shielded Zara. "She's asleep," Amara said before he could ask. She didn't look up from her beads. "The excitement of a gang war is a lot for a 6-year-old. Adrian stepped into the low light of the stall's single hanging bulb. The shadows cast by his sharp jawline made him look older, more tired. He reached out and touched the edge of the wooden counter, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood she had worked so hard to keep clean. "Made sure they won't come back, Amara," he said, his voice a low, rough vibration. "The men in gray, they won't be a problem for you or anyone else in this market again." "You can't promise that, Adrian," Amara said, finally setting the beads down. She looked at him, her eyes reflecting the amber glow of the light. "In your world, there is always another man in a gray jacket. There's always someone hungrier, someone younger, someone looking to take what you have. And today, what you have, it's us." Adrian's hand tightened on the wood. "I didn't choose for them to follow me here." "You chose to come here," she countered. She stood up, walking around the counter until she was standing directly in front of him. The height difference was still there, but the power had shifted. "You came back for the tea, then for the inspection, then for the etiquette class. But we both know why you're really here, standing in the mud at a fruit stall instead of in a boardroom." Adrian looked away, his gaze drifting to the closed door of the back room where Zara lay sleeping. I told you. I remembered the clinic. I remembered the girl who didn't ask for my name before she saved my life. You remember more than that, Amara whispered. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. It was a Polaroid, the edges yellowed with age. It showed a younger Amara, leaning against the doorframe of the clinic, and beside her, a shadow of a man whose face was turned away but whose wrist, clearly visible, bore a fresh, jagged crescent scar. Adrian took the photo. His fingers brushed against hers, and this time she didn't pull away. He stared at the image as if it were a map to a country he had been exiled from. That night, Amara began, her voice steady but thick with the weight of 6 years of silence. You were bleeding out. You told me you were done with the life. You told me you wanted to go somewhere where the sun didn't feel like a spotlight. We were two people who had nothing, Adrian, just a shared loaf of bread and a few hours before the sun came up. I meant what I said, Adrian muttered, his eyes still on the photo. But the life doesn't let you go. It finds you. I know, she said. It found me, too. 9 months later, it gave me a daughter with your gray eyes and your stubborn chin. It gave me a girl who doesn't know how to be afraid because she thinks her father is a ghost who was a hero. Silence that followed was so heavy it felt like it might break the floorboards. Adrian finally looked up, the photo trembling slightly in his hand. The armor he had spent years building, the coldness, the detached violence, the most feared man persona, seemed to crack and fall away in the dim light of the market stall. You knew, he said. It wasn't a question. I knew the moment I saw you walk into this market, Amara said. I saw the way you looked at her. I saw the way you moved when that display started to fall. You didn't protect her because you're a good man, Adrian. You protected her because your blood recognized hers. Adrian closed his eyes, a single, sharp breath escaping his lungs. He leaned his forehead against the wooden pillar of the stall, the cool wood a contrast to the heat rising in his skin. For a man who dealt in certainties and executions, the truth was the one thing he wasn't prepared to handle. She's mine, he whispered. She is herself, Amara corrected gently. But yes, she is your daughter. Her name is Zara, and the beads she wears in her hair, every time she adds a new one, she makes a wish. Do you know what she wished for last night after you left? Adrian shook his head, his eyes opening, wide and raw. She wished that the Mr. suit with the moon on his wrist would stop being a cloud, Amara said. She thinks you're lonely. Even at 6 years old, she can see the holes in your life that you try to fill with tailored suits and expensive cars. Adrian looked toward the back room again. The realization was no longer a suspicion or a feeling. It was a living, breathing reality. He had a daughter. He had a child who looked at him and saw a student, not a monster. He had a family that he had been standing next to for a week, pretending he was just there for the tea. What am I supposed to do, Amara? He asked, his voice breaking. I am the head of a syndicate. My name is a target. If I claim her, if I bring her into my world, she'll never be safe again. The men in gray jackets, they were just the beginning. Then don't bring her into your world, Amara said, taking a step closer until her hand rested on his bandaged arm. Come into ours. Put down the suit. Stop being the boss for an hour a day. Be the man who was in that clinic alley. The man who shared his bread and promised to be better. Adrian looked at her hand on his arm, then back at her face. He saw the strength that had raised a child alone in a city that tried to swallow them whole. He saw the dignity she carried, a wealth that his bank accounts could never match. I don't know how to be that man anymore, he admitted. Zara will teach, said with a small, sad smile. She's already started. She gave you a C- today. I think you can do better tomorrow. Adrian let out a short, jagged laugh that sounded more like a sob. He handed the photo back to her, but his hand stayed on hers for a moment longer. He looked at the orange beads scattered on the counter, the truth in the beads that had finally linked their past to their present. Have to go, he said, the old habit of the life pulling at him. There are things I need to settle, things I need to make. Safe. Adrian, she called out as he turned to the car. He stopped, his hand on the door handle. Don't come back because you feel you have to. Come back because you want to know her, because she already loves you and she doesn't even know why. Adrian didn't respond with words. He simply nodded, a slow, solemn vow, and climbed into the car. As the black sedan pulled away, leaving the market to the shadows and the rain, Amara stood in the light of her stall. She picked up the string of beads and finished the pattern. In the back room, Zara stirred in her sleep, dreaming of brave butterflies and men who learned how to smile. And in the back of the car, Adrian Volkov stared at his wrist, at the crescent moon scar, and realized that for the first time in 6 years, he knew exactly where he was going. He wasn't going to a meeting or a war. He was going home. He just had to figure out how to get there. High-rise office of Volkov Enterprises was a world away from the humid, spice-scented air of the market. Here, the glass was triple-paned and soundproof, overlooking a city that Adrian Volkov theoretically owned. But as he sat behind his massive mahogany desk, his bandaged arm resting stiffly on the leather surface, the room felt smaller than the fruit stall. The silence here wasn't peaceful. It was hollow. Viktor Sokolov stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his silhouette dark against the city lights. He hadn't spoken since they left the market. He was waiting for the order that usually followed an ambush, the order to find a warehouse, to bring the tools of his trade, and to erase the men who had dared to touch the boss. "The Greeks are calling," Viktor said finally, his voice tight with a suppressed agitation. "They heard about the market. They think Uray distracted. They're removing their shipments through the North Docks tonight, bypassing our percentage because they think the lion is busy playing with kittens." Adrian didn't look at him. He was looking at a single orange bead he had found caught in the cuff of his shirt. He rolled it between his thumb and forefinger, the plastic clicking softly. "Let them move the shipment." Viktor turned sharply, his face a mask of disbelief. "Sir, if we let them slide once, the Italians will follow, then the cartel. We'll lose the docks by the weekend. We need to strike back. We need to show them that nothing has changed." "Everything has changed, Viktor," Adrian said, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that made the enforcer go still. He finally looked up, his gray eyes piercing. "I spent an hour yesterday shielding a child from falling wood while you were shooting at boys in gray jackets. Do you know what I felt?" Viktor hesitated. "Anger, sir, a desire for revenge." "I felt alive," Adrian whispered. "For the first time in 6 years, I wasn't thinking about percentages or territory or who wanted me dead. I was thinking about a little girl who thinks I am a C- student because I don't smile enough. I was thinking about a woman who saved my life when I was nothing, and who I managed to fail anyway." Viktor walked toward the desk, his boots heavy on the plush carpet. "Boss, with all respect, this is a weakness. The city lives on fear. If you stop being the man they fear, you stop being the man who survives. You have a daughter now. That doesn't make you stronger in this world. It makes you a target with a name." Adrian stood up, his height filling the room. He walked around the desk until he was inches from Viktor. The two men had bled together, had built this empire from the ashes of their youth. There was a deep, unspoken brotherhood between them, but it was a brotherhood forged in the dark. "Is power just the ability to kill, Viktor?" Adrian asked. "Is that all we've built? A kingdom where the only thing we're good at is making people disappear. It's what keeps us at the top," Viktor insisted. "No," Adrian countered. "It's what keeps us in a cage. Look at yourself. You're the most dangerous enforcer in the city, and you were terrified of a 6-year-old girl in a bright dress. Why? Because she saw through you. She saw that you're just a man who forgot how to be a person." Viktor looked away, his jaw working. He remembered the feeling of Zara's tiny fingers pushing at the corners of his mouth. He remembered the way she had called him Mr. Grumpy without an ounce of malice. It had been the most honest interaction he'd had in a decade. "I am redefining what power looks like for this organization," Adrian continued, his voice hardening into a new kind of authority. "From now on, we don't rule through the chaos. We protect the peace. The market is off limits, not just for us, but for anyone. If a single hair on a single vendor is touched, the consequences will be absolute. But we aren't going to the docks tonight to kill Greeks." "Then what are we doing?" "We are going to make an example of the men who attack the market," Adrian said. "But not the way you think. We're not going to execute them. We're going to hand them over to the police with enough evidence to bury them for life, and we're going to do it publicly." Viktor's eyes widened. "The police? Since when do we talk to the cops?" "Since we decided that Zara deserves to grow up in a city where her father isn't the biggest monster under the bed," Adrian replied. "I am not closing the business, Viktor. I am cleaning it. We have the logistics, the money, and the influence. We use it to build something that isn't made of blood. If the other families think that's a weakness, let them come. They'll find out that a man with something to protect is 10 times more dangerous than a man with nothing to lose." Viktor stared at him for a long time. He looked at the boss he had followed into hell, and he realized the stone had truly softened. But it hadn't become fragile, it had become an anchor. "Dmitri and Leon, they're already at the market," Viktor said, his voice softening. "They didn't even ask for orders, they just went. They said the teacher needed her stall rebuilt by morning." Adrian felt a strange, warm pressure behind his eyes. He nodded slowly. Good. Tell them to make sure the wood is reinforced, and buy some ginger. Zara says it's good for the bubbles in your stomach. Victor let out a short, dry laugh. He straightened his jacket, the tension in his shoulders finally beginning to ebb. C-, sir, really? I'm working on it, Adrian said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. Handle the Greeks, Victor said, turning toward the door. But I'll do it your way, no bodies, just business. Victor, the enforcer, stopped. Thank you. Victor didn't turn around, but his head dipped in a sharp, respectful nod before he vanished into the hallway. Adrian walked back to the window. He looked out at the city, but he wasn't looking at the docks or the rival territories. He was looking at the small, dark patch of the city where the market sat. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the orange bead. He realized that Zara hadn't just given him an etiquette class. She had given him a way out. Power wasn't about the size of his army or the depth of the fear he inspired. It was about the fact that he could walk into a market, buy a cup of tea from a woman who knew his soul, and hear a child call him something other than a boss. He sat back down and picked up a pen. He didn't start a hit list. He started a plan for a foundation, a way to funnel the Volkov wealth into the schools and clinics of the district. It was the first step on a very long road to being the man Amara remembered. The stone hadn't just softened, it had been carved into something new. As the city lights flickered below, Adrian Volkov realized he wasn't afraid of the future anymore. He was ready for the next lesson, and he knew exactly who his teacher was going to be. The following Sunday, the market felt different. The scars of the skirmish had been replaced by fresh wood and bright paint. Dimitri and Leon had spent 2 full nights ensuring the new stall was not only sturdy, but elegant, with reinforced pillars and a wider counter for Zara to display her treasures. There were no black SUVs idling at the curb today. There were no armed men standing in a perimeter. The market was allowed to be just a market, a place of noise, color, and the smell of roasting maize. Amara was busy arranging the last of the hibiscus flowers when she felt a familiar presence. She didn't look up immediately, her heart doing that strange, fluttering dance it had learned to do over the past week. She reached for a bundle of cinnamon sticks, her fingers brushing against a hand that was already there, helping her steady the pile. Adrian Volkov was dressed in a simple dark sweater and charcoal trousers. He looked younger, the harsh lines of his face softened by the morning light. He wasn't the kingpin today. He looked like a man who had finally found the right street after being lost for a very long time. The stall looks good, Adrian said softly. It's too much, Adrian, Amara replied, though there was no bite in her voice. You didn't have to rebuild the whole block. I wanted to make sure the foundations were deep, he said, his eyes meeting hers. For everyone, Zara emerged from the back of the stall, her orange dress replaced by a new one in a deep royal purple, though her round glasses were still perched firmly on her nose. She stopped when she saw him, her eyes widening. She walked over and circled him twice, as if checking to see if he was real or if he had brought any clouds with him. No suit, she asked, tilting her head. No suit, Adrian confirmed, crouching down to her level. No grumpy friends, they are taking a day off. I think Dimitri is actually at a motorcycle show. He said he wanted to practice his crinkly eyes on some strangers. Zara giggled, a bright melodic sound that seemed to make the heavy air of the market lighter. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a single bead, a crystal clear one that caught the sun like a diamond. She pressed it into Adrian's palm. That's for your prayer list, she whispered. So you don't forget to be a gentleman, even when I am not looking. Adrian closed his hand over the bead, his expression turning solemn. He looked at Amara, then back at the little girl who had dismantled his empire with a few lessons in etiquette. He realized that the debt he owed this child couldn't be paid in gold or territory. It could only be paid in the currency she had demanded from the very first second they met. He looked around the stall. There were no expensive chairs here, just the humble tools of a woman who had built a life out of nothing. He pulled a small, blue plastic crate from under the counter and set it down in the dirt. With the grace of a man who was no longer afraid of the ground, he sat on it. The most feared man in the city sat on a cracked plastic crate at a fruit stall, his knees nearly reaching his chin, looking up at a 6-year-old girl and her mother. Zara, he said, his voice steady and clear, reaching through the noise of the market. And Amara stopped what she was doing, her breath hitching. She stood beside her daughter, her hand resting on Zara's shoulder. A week ago, Adrian began, my man was rude. He was a cloud, as you say, and I allowed it. I was arrogant and I treated this place, and your mother, with a lack of respect that I cannot take back. But I can tell you that I am sorry, truly sorry. Not just for that day, but for the years I wasn't here to make sure no one ever treated you that way again. The apology hung in the air, simple and unadorned. There were no excuses about the life he led or the scars he carried. It was just a man, a woman, and their child. Zara looked at him for a long time. She adjusted her glasses, her expression grave. She looked at her mother, who was biting her lip, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Then Zara stepped forward and patted Adrian's shoulder, exactly the way she had done when she was teaching him how to smile. Apology accepted, Mr. Suit, she said firmly. You're a B+ student now. Adrian let out a breath he felt he had been holding for 6 years. He stood up, the plastic crate creaking as he rose. He didn't reach for his phone or look at his watch. He looked at the family table, the wooden counter of the stall, and saw the life he wanted. I brought something, Adrian said, reaching into a small bag he had carried. He pulled out a loaf of fresh, warm bread, still wrapped in paper. Amara's eyes went wide. It was the same kind of bread they had shared in the clinic alley. The scent of it filled the small space, a bridge between the boy he had been and the man he was becoming. I thought we could have breakfast, he said tentatively, if there's enough room at the stall. Amara looked at the bread, then at the man who had traveled through fire just to sit on a plastic crate. She reached out and took the bread, her fingers lingering on his. There's always room for family, Adrian, she said, her voice finally breaking into a smile. They sat together behind the counter, hidden from the prying eyes of the market by the hanging bags of herbs and the tall stacks of yams. They shared the bread, breaking off pieces for Zara, who insisted on telling Adrian a very long story about a butterfly that learned how to roar. From across the market, Daniel Reyes watched through his binoculars one last time. He saw the three of them laughing, the mob boss head tilted back in a genuine, unforced laugh as the little girl fed him a piece of crust. Daniel lowered his camera. He didn't take the photo. Some things weren't for the files. Some things were just for the soul. He turned off his radio, packed his gear, and walked away, leaving the Volkov case behind him in the dust. The sun climbed higher, warming the market and the people in it. Adrian sat at the table he had once tried to ignore, realizing that Zara was right. Boldness didn't have a size requirement, and neither did happiness. It didn't require a high-rise or an army. It just required the courage to say you were wrong and the heart to come home. As Zara's colorful beads clicked in the breeze, the family of 3 that had only existed in a black marker drawing finally stood in the light. The lion had been tamed, not by force, but by the simple, persistent love of a girl in an orange dress. And as Adrian looked at Amara and Zara, he knew that the etiquette class was over. He had finally learned the most important lesson of all, how to belong.